Well, I would also like to just say, as we're getting towards the end of the month here, I've been to quite a few conferences over the years. I think this is my fifth, and it's always great content. I'm always excited to hear the speakers, but this year, PGNO has really outdone themselves with finding some really great sessions that I personally have enjoyed, and the speakers have been wonderful. So thank you to PGNO as well for just really doing a knockout job in what's been a super challenging year, and finding great engagement and great speakers. It's also been wonderful. I don't think I've been on any of these presentations that have had less than 75 people. So that's also really exciting, just that so many people are able to hear and listen to this great content that we're providing. So good afternoon. Thank you again for attending today's session on using technology to disproportionately scale awareness for problem gambling. Technology is definitely something that is coming into play more and more and more. My name is Beth Burson, and I am here on behalf of Ohio for Responsible Gambling. I work for Origo Branding Company as a media buyer and planner. Many of you have worked with me to customize or co-brand materials for your specific market, even though for Ohio for Responsible Gambling, I do most of the placing for our statewide campaign for both Get Set Before You Bet and our Change the Game Ohio, focusing on adult to youth influencers. Both of these campaigns were created with the intention to help educate and raise awareness around problem gambling in Ohio for at-risk populations and influencers who can help create positive change in their community. So I know leading up to March, many of you, like I talk to every year, but it's always nice to get to meet some newbies. And this year I certainly have, and that's been wonderful and exciting. Don't ever hesitate to reach out. I love talking with each and every one of you. We have campaign assets that target everyone from youth to minority populations to seniors to sports bettors, with the main goal in mind to help provide tools and materials that you can use within your region. We will get you what you need. I will make sure that we're able to help you sort of spread the message about prevention and problem gambling in your area. Accessing these materials is super easy. You just visit beforeyoubet.org and click on the community toolkit. There is a password. The reason there's a password is just so I can keep track of what portions of the state of Ohio are tapping into this resource to share materials. We like to keep a little running ticker on that, just so we know who's really like digging in and engaging, and who maybe we need to reach out to that hasn't dug in yet. Maybe they just aren't aware. It's as simple as emailing me at beth@origobranding.com. And certainly if we haven't connected in the past, I look forward to connecting with you in the future. I'm always available to help if you need just have some ideas you want to talk through. I'm happy to do that. Or if you know exactly what you want, I'm happy to help you with that too. But with no further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Jamie Salsburg.
Unmute. You'd think this deep into coronavirus, we would have all these things covered, but unfortunately, not so much. All right, now let me get my screen here shared, and we will be off to go. I had this already. Can everyone still see this? Yes, no? All right. So first of all, thank you for that introduction, Beth. Thanks, Derek, and the whole team at PGNO. This is something I always like to say up front. This is like my Christmas morning. I get to talk about problem gambling and marketing. And when you bring those two things together, I absolutely love it, because those are my two worlds that I'm most passionate about. So I'm really excited to be here and to share sort of my story along with some of the ideas that we have for scaling awareness for problem gambling. Now, I've been on a lot of these, and I always like to start off with getting an outline just because I know it helps to know where we're going, right? So we're going to start off. I'm going to share my story of gambling addiction. For many years, I suffered with a pretty severe addiction to online poker and live poker. I'm going to share that story for a lot of reasons, but I think most of all, it really helps me to hear other people's stories. And so I'll be sharing that story to hopefully trigger some ideas or insight. It's kind of where the stories are, as Brene Brown likes to say, it's data with a soul. And so hopefully you'll be able to kind of get some information or some insight from me sharing my story that is something that you can kind of help connect dots. And then the second part, we're going to talk about a case study, the podcast that I created to help scale attention. And again, use that. I'll just talk about some of the reasons behind why I started the podcast, some of the things that have helped me along the way. So we'll use that as a case study. And then we'll get into the third part, which is actionable ideas, the stuff that hopefully you will take with you today. And start to just kind of get some ideas going that can really help you as you try to get more awareness for problem gambling. And then we're going to leave a lot of time at the end for a Q&A and discussion. And then I have some goals set up for this session. Hopefully, want you to maximize it. And so one thing that I always do as a marketer, I'm always looking for patterns. I'm looking for what is it, what's there. There's something there. I've heard that. I've seen that. Whether it's in the story or when I'm looking at other people and they're doing campaigns, marketing campaigns, what are the patterns? What are the things that are working? So that's one of those things that I hope you look for today. What are those things? And then secondly, look for opportunities. Whenever I'm listening to podcasts or videos or on webinars, it always triggers some new ideas. And it's like, oh, that's something I can use to implement and to scale awareness for my programming. So use that. And those two things kind of sum up the third one, which is to think like a marketer. Marketers, we're genuinely curious. We're always looking for new and different ways to try different things. And so it's be a little bit curious, and throughout this session, do that. And then finally, use me as a resource. I always say, the one thing all of us that have kind of suffered some kind of gambling harm and now are kind of trying to help other people, we love to help. And so at any point, if I can be of help today or in the future, please continue to use me as a resource. And then the next one, and this is probably the most important slide of the day, please interrupt me. I'm used to starting and stopping. So if you have questions along the way, I'm going to have the little chat box up here because I think it's important also, just the marketer in me likes to answer questions in the flow of the discussion. There have been times where I get on these and I have a question and then you get to the very end and you have to go way back and it's just kind of out of context. So please enter any questions along the way. I'd love to answer them in the context of the discussion. So with that said, we'll start off with kind of sharing my story. Obviously, start off with the path that led me to running off the riverboat. I'm not sure how many people have heard my story. I do a podcast, so I've pretty much shared it at length. But on July 15th of 2010, I was on a riverboat in Gary, Indiana, and I ran off that riverboat, and that was the last day that I gambled. So we're going to kind of start off with that as the framework. That was over 10 and a half years ago. But today I wanted to go back to the very beginning and talk about some of the things that I haven't even talked about too much. So it's kind of unique for this one. But my journey with gambling, as you'll see, is full of twists and turns. I've been on all sides of this addiction. And so it really helped me to understand it intimately, the good and the bad. So that's where we'll start today. So I want to start off, something I've never talked about is my very first casino I ever went to. And oops, Corey says the slides aren't changing. Let me see here. I think I've got the wrong thing shared. Apologize for that. Are we able to see these now?
That's great.
All right. Sorry about that, everyone. So yeah, my first casino. And it was actually something that if you have kids, you've probably seen it as well, which is a Chuck E. Cheese. And something I never really thought about too much, but if you look at Chuck E. Cheese now, and especially I have kids that are 8 and 6, and you go in there and so many of the things in there have the same kind of mechanics as so many of our gambling things. Well, me as a kid and my mom and dad, like we would go to Chuck E. Cheese and celebrate good report cards. It was something, they had a program there where you would get rewarded with free tokens when you would go with good report cards. So whenever we had good A's and B's, you'd get credit, right? And so it was something that we always would go to. And I never really thought about it too much until recently. And you hear these stories, and this is where the stories come in. Listening to so many of my friends in the UK talking about going to the seaside arcades as kids. And that really got me to think, and obviously my experience as a parent now. And I started to see, and now if I look back and reflect, I start to see some of the patterns that were developing even as a at a very young age. At Chuck E. Cheese, it was the first place where I started to sort of look at, how do I game this system, right? And I was one of the ones, you get so many tokens, and then how do we get these tickets in order to get some prize at the end? And so while we would play a lot of the different games, we definitely, my friends and I, some of my siblings, we would try to play certain games because they were the ones that were most likely to give us a payout that was more tickets. In our case, that was skee ball. And so when I look back at that, that was one of the first things, probably one of their first gambling experiences. And I don't bring this up as a knock on Chuck E. Cheese. And all throughout my story, I try to share these things just because I think it helps us to get a little bit more curious and think about, what are these other things that are happening in people's lives? What are the stories that are leading up to gambling addiction, leading up to me where I had to run off the riverboat because my life was in ruins? So that was the first one. And then obviously gambling just continued to be a part of my life in a lot of ways. I was an athlete, and especially a golfer. I picked up golf and fell in love with the game when I was 8 years old. It was something that I was very passionate about. And as golfers, we're always playing for something. I mean, early on, it was just my dad and I playing for a milkshake, right? Like nothing big, nothing harmful, but it just was part of the game. Gambling is part of our society in a lot of ways. And especially as a golfer, it was especially true. Even my very first hole in one, which, I mean, golfers, we all look for our hole in ones. It's like this memorable thing. For me, it was memorable because I was about 14 years old and I got on the last hole, it was the ninth hole. And there were so many carryovers and skins in our friends group, and we would play just for lunch money, quarters, whatever. I won like $10, which at the time I felt like, wow, I mean, I've won so much money. I won Taco Bell money for the week. And again, I'm bringing these up just to point out like some of these patterns that we have. So when we talk about awareness, like we have to realize that gambling is something that is just part of society and part of a lot of people's lives. Even we don't really know necessarily that it might lead to other problems down the road. And then as I continue on, I mean, my next kind of stop in this journey was I was in Atlantic City, again, for a golf tournament. I remember explicitly being 17 years old, because that's how old I was playing the tournament. And I'd never been to Las Vegas, never been to Atlantic City. So my mom and I, on one of the day offs, we went up to the casino and just kind of the strip to look around. And I remember walking up, and I got right to the edge of the floor, and a casino employee came up and said, "How old are you?" And I said my age, and he said, "Okay, you can't come any further." And it was one of those things that was obviously a protection mechanism, right? Like can't have underage on the floor. But in my head, what was going on was, wow, okay, this is something I want to come back to when I'm older. And it kind of that barrier is a barrier that we absolutely have to have. But in my head, it was okay. It was one of those things that right then I knew that whenever I turned of age, I was going to try to go to a casino and to do some gambling. It kind of created some intrigue for me. And then when I was 19, a few years later, I kind of scratched that itch. Being in Ohio, obviously we're close to Canada, and 19 was the legal age in Canada to gamble and to drink. So I went up there. My sister was actually living in Buffalo at the time, and we went across the bridge and we played the slots. And to be honest, I thought it was absolutely not much fun. I put my $20 in and lost it like most people do in a couple of minutes, and kind of was like, this is really not for me, right? It just was not interesting. And then along the way, and this is where things really kind of get interesting as far as just for the later on, is I then saw gambling addiction firsthand from the loved one side. And so many times we focus on like my story of gambling harm, but we miss the story of the families, the friends, all the other people that are affected. And I was one of those people. One of my closest friends started gambling, developed a pretty bad gambling habit, and all of a sudden they were reaching out for me for financial help. And of course, being their friend, I tried to do that. And it was the first time and that combined with some of my previous experiences, I just was like, man, I do not like this. This is no good. Like gambling, like I absolutely hated gambling. Because I saw firsthand the devastation, and that's why, like, when I do the podcast now and share, I understand that side of it, and I don't know that people necessarily always understand that I've been on that side as well, and it was absolutely heartbreaking to see and to experience the devastation, and just to try everything you possibly could to help somebody, but it just seemed like nothing would work, and so that really got me frustrated. And over that time, I mean, at the time I was golfing in college. I was a Division I college athlete, very competitive. Had that happen, so I was kind of dealing with that, trying to help out my friend. My golf game had gone south. For anybody that plays golf, I had the shanks, and so that was kind of the end of my college career in a lot of ways. And ultimately, I just felt like I needed to get a job to help make some money back, because I was sending a lot to my friend. So I quit golf, and started working at FedEx loading trucks, and then later on, and I went on to caddy. And so at this point, like there's a lot of things going on in my life, and just in a lot of ways, typical turmoil, right? Like most 20 somethings in college are experiencing these things: relationship issues, financial issues, fears, anxiety, all these things. But for me, they were kind of buried under. Like I probably felt them and realized they were happening, but I didn't name it. I didn't have a name for them. And so I was kind of looking for different ways. At the time, I was probably drinking quite a bit, definitely was. And like I said, it was still golfing, but casually. And that was the summer that I kind of compare it to what I see now going on, because the summer of 2003, I was 21. We obviously didn't have casinos here in Ohio at the time, because I'm a little bit older. But the World Series of Poker was being shown on ESPN for the first time. So it was the first time that gambling really kind of was taking center stage on something like ESPN and getting a lot of publicity. All of a sudden there were ads for it. And I went from being a kid, and I remember the very first time that I played poker, because again, I played a little bit of, I mean, I had the Chuck E. Cheese, which is gambling-ish, whatever. But didn't come from a family of gamblers. A little bit of sports betting on my own golf game, but no real casino interest, no card games. And so I sat down a card game with my friends, just because it was what we were doing before we went out for the night on the town, and started playing poker, watching them play poker. And that was the very first exposure to it. And I was a math kid. And so all of a sudden, as they're explaining the game and introducing me to what hand beat what and the probability, it was something I really took to. And that, combined with obviously being on the World Series of Poker on TV, it was something that all of a sudden there was a ton of exposure for it. And it just felt like everybody was doing it, because in my house of 7 guys in college, pretty much everybody was playing. We'd have home games, and it just became something that we were all sort of doing, and we didn't really question it or think twice of it. And especially for me at the time, now looking back, I see that I was using that as an escapism, and a way to kind of fill some of the voids that were going on in my life. But it was something I just didn't understand at the time. And that's why I'm a little bit fearful, obviously, of everything that's going on now. And so pretty soon, I mean, I started playing online. But again, with my background and knowing and seeing how much gambling could hurt firsthand, it wasn't something that I really was careless about. I was actually very much the responsible gambler. I'd deposit $25. If it went up to 50, I'd cash that out. And this was back when the cash outs were automatic. And I really played kind of within the boundaries, or within the buoys, as I like to say, for a little while. But then it was one of those things that pretty soon it started dominating my time. And my friends and I mean, the games were every week, but that wasn't enough. And so I started playing online, because we didn't have local card games. There were some, but they were not ones that I was willing to go to at that time. But online made it available. And that's why we always talk about some of the A's, and availability is one of those huge ones, that once it became available and I could just sit in my room in college and play poker, all of a sudden things changed. I was playing quite a bit more, and really starting to dig the start of some financial holes. And I was able to cover it up, because as most gamblers, we have the sort of the big win, right? That is the thing that keeps us going. And for me, I was in my 4th year of college. So I'm here fearing going out and getting a real world job, a big boy job. And I started the month with $100, and I was playing online poker. And at the end of the month, I had a little over $4,000. And I'm sitting there doing the math, and I'm saying, my friend who's in accounting just got a job and he's making like 50,000. Heck, this is 50,000. I can sit here and play poker. Sure, sign me up. And I used that story, and that month always was kind of the one that I would turn back to whenever things would go bad. It was like, oh no, I can get it going again. Oh, I can get it going again. And over the next 5 years, I used that story to pretty much really dig myself a huge financial hole. It was something that it was fully consuming me. I mean, I would stop. I would drive across town to my grandmother's house, and I would stop to play poker on the way on my phone or on my desktop laptop at Panera Bread. I'd be sitting at the airport and I'd be playing online, waiting for the plane. And there was one time I almost didn't make the plane because I was sitting there. So I was just so obsessed with it. And things just continued to spiral out of control. And it was one of those things that I saw it happening in a lot of ways, probably knowing what happened to my friend. I probably was in denial that that was actually happening to me as well. But yeah, it just continued to get worse and worse. And I'd reach out to my mom for help, and she'd help me out financially. I'd promise not to do it. And I really, truly wanted to mean it, but the addiction was just too strong. And I ended up back chasing that story of, I can do this, I can bail myself out, and nobody will have to know just how bad things have gotten. And I did that for a long time, until at one point it just wasn't possible anymore. My mom said, I'm not going to do this. And at the time, and I needed to quit. And I kind of leaned on just the cold turkey approach, and that helped me out for 9 months. And I got to the point where I didn't gamble for 9 months, and I was really feeling great. But I wasn't doing anything else aside from just quitting cold turkey. And that was something that obviously is a dangerous path. And within a couple text messages, hey, come play poker. Oh, it's just a small $20 game. Within 3 or 4 days, I was right back to playing online for huge stakes and losing thousands of dollars. So as you can imagine, consistent losses over many years, compounded by not focusing on my business, trying to put on this front that I was living kind of a great life when the reality was I wasn't. And I was doing a good enough job to fake it that my then girlfriend became my fiance. And fortunately, there's a good end to this story. She's now my wife. But I would lie to her, and she knew that I quit for 9 months, but she didn't know the extent of my gambling, that I had gotten back into it. And then it all came to a head in July of 2010. I was in Chicago for a conference, and it was one of those things where I woke up at 5 a.m. the crazy ththings that we do in order to make sure that we can gamble. And I didn't know for sure that I was going to stop at the riverboat on the way home, but obviously I got up at 5 a.m. So there's probably a reason that I was going to. So I got up, I ended up going there, and all of a sudden I'm playing for a while. I'm playing, and all of a sudden my phone starts ringing. I'm like, look down, it's my fiance. Why is she calling me? She's supposed to be at work. And I click off of it. And then she calls back, click off of it, calls back again, click off of it. And finally, I scroll my phone, and I realized that I had pocket dialed her out from the table first. And so obviously you can imagine the things that are running through my head. I didn't know what she had heard. This was 60 days before our wedding, which was obviously terrible timing, and just showcased how awful I was at the time. And it was just devastating. And I literally ran to the window to cash out. I think I had $100 and some. I was literally like, just give me $100. Let me run and get the hell out of here. Ran off the riverboat, called her, and for the first time was honest with somebody about the fact that I was still gambling and the depths that I had gotten to. And I truly wanted to stop. And that was one of the longest rides home from Chicago. But on that day, I started making the changes that I never made when I was doing the cold turkey approach. And I started calling friends that I gambled with and said, I'm done. And I talked to my sister, who was very supportive along the way, and she kind of gave me some ideas on things that I needed to do to start changing my life. And I'll never forget when I got back to Akron. I was obviously in a pretty beat down state. And I was very fortunate that Lindsay looked at me when we met, and she said, look, Jamie, I know you have a problem. And she actually laughed and said, you're lucky I watched the show Intervention, because I know that you have a problem and I know you can get help. Here's where the next GA meeting is, and you're going to go, and you're going to get on that path and start getting help. And like I said, that was on July 15th of 2010. And I feel so blessed and excited and all those things to know, now look fast back at that 10 and a half years later, to know that everything changed in a moment. And again, I share my story, and we'll get into the other stuff now, but I share it because hopefully you'll see some patterns there. But also ultimately, like, it's my hope to understand, and we need to kind of continue to amplify the message that this is something that is completely treatable. It is definitely something we can treat. They're all awesome. I'm sure on this, there are tons of specialists, and that's why I'm so passionate about this. We just need to amplify that fact and get more people coming out to get help, because it's something I just didn't know. And so I'm excited and hopeful that we're going to be able to create some opportunities to help more people as we go along. And so that kind of, let me switch here, get to the next. That kind of leads me to the next part, which is kind of the case study on reaching out to the hard to reach with limited resources. Because ultimately, this is the challenge I faced, you face. We all have very limited resources at the moment. And we're kind of going up against an industry that has seemingly unlimited resources. And so it can be very frustrating. But hopefully with the case study, and we'll have some ideas here today that can help us to start to create some ideas that can really start to scale and can overcome some of that gap. Now for me, as I mentioned earlier, most problem gamblers, we want to help. We want to reach out. We want to pay it forward. And so it was probably 3 years in to my time at Gamblers Anonymous. I was working with a therapist who was absolutely wonderful. And the idea of kind of paying it forward or sharing my story came up. I was like, yeah, that's something I want to do. Well, I tend to overthink things. And so about 4 years later, I decided that, okay, I'm going to start actually doing this. I bought the domain name Gambling Still Sucks. But over that time, the one thing I kept seeing were people coming into Gamblers Anonymous and they'd want to get help. And maybe they would stay for a little while and get some success, but then they were gone. But in addition to that, I would also see so many people that I just knew were never going to come through that door. People like me, that if it wasn't for Lindsay saying, this is where the meeting is, you're going, they were just not going to get there. And obviously I was one of the youngest ones at GA. I went in at 28. And I was in a room where the average age, I probably brought the average age down to about 60. And so I just knew there was a whole population like myself that weren't going to get the resources of GA. And so I started thinking, okay, maybe a blog is the way to reach people. And so I had started kind of planning out the blog, but then along the way, I listened to a lot of podcasts. And I don't know how many podcast fans we have now. I mean, obviously it's a medium that's grown quite a bit, but I listened to a lot of business podcasts. And that was kind of one of my thoughts was, okay, maybe this is the thing. Maybe this is a great way that we can reach these people on ground that is safe for them, something that maybe they can go to. And it doesn't have sort of the shame and stigma that we always talk about when it comes to problem gambling and sort of admitting that you have a problem or starting to even just seek out information. I mean, I can say it. Even when I went to the riverboat the last day, I almost left because I didn't want them to scan my ID, because I didn't want them to track me and send any information. Like so problem gamblers, like, we are always elusive. We're very hard to reach and very hard to kind of get a hold of. But so I had the idea of doing the podcast. And it was something that I kind of thought about for a while. And then I give so much credit to Brian Hatch, who does All in the Addicted Gamblers podcast. Hopefully you're familiar with that, or if you're not, go out and check him out. But I listened to his podcast, and I saw, because one day I was just scrolling through, I'm like, is there a gambling one out there? And it was Brian's. And at the time it was much different than it was today. And I'm like, okay, I think there's a way that we can use this to start to reach out to other people. And ultimately to create that bridge that helps people get to help. Because the thing I was thinking about with podcasting is it's a safe space. Like, ultimately, like, you can just throw your earbuds in and nobody has to know what you're listening to. And I think even with hotlines and all those things, they're all great resources. But I can say personally, like, I was always worried, like, are they going to track me? Are they going to hunt me down? Like, are they going to be able to, like, coming back to ask me questions? And so identifying ways that we can reach this audience in a way that is comfortable for them, it was important. So I started the podcast 3 years ago on my birthday, a little over 3 years ago. And it was one of those things that it was a huge relief in a lot of ways, because I'd been building it up for a long time. Started sharing it. And along the way, I was also very active in the Reddit community. Reddit has a great online forum, which, for anybody that's not familiar with Reddit, if you think of the 90s forums where people post things and people comment, that's what it was. There's also kind of a chat function on Discord. And so I was active in all those things, and I used those platforms to also start to kind of say, hey, I created this podcast, what do you think? And early on, I remember going to my GA meeting, and a lot of the people there were very supportive of it, and saying, hey, we got 40 or 50 downloads. And I was so excited because I'm like, okay, that's maybe one person or two people that maybe listen to it and can get help. Because ultimately, and that's the other concept with the podcast, was I knew just how powerful the stories were that I had gotten from GA. And I attribute much of my ability to abstain from gambling to those stories. Because anytime I think about, okay, maybe I don't need to go anymore, then I'm thinking, oh, I know X, a certain person, and they stopped for this amount of time, but then they stopped going to meetings and stopped doing stuff, and all of a sudden back to gambling. So I had all these stories, and that was really what I thought. And my goal was with the podcast was to deliver some of these stories to people in a comfortable way. As I said, I was very much hand-to-hand combat, answering questions, going on Reddit, going on Discord, and ultimately pointing people to this resource that I created, the podcast, to help them be able to get help. And it was really rewarding because I started to see the downloads increase. And ultimately, I started getting more and more messages. And people were saying exactly what I thought. Like, just, hey, I listen to it every day when I'm going on the train to work. I even had somebody that messaged me and said, I'm so glad now they talk to their spouse and they actually listen to the podcast together, and they're able to talk through their gambling, past gambling together. But at one point, they would actually delete the podcast every time they'd listen to it so that the spouse didn't know that it was on their phone. But over time, it's been one of those things that's really grown, and creating that resource, and using the technology behind, obviously, podcasting. And there's other things that we can talk about later. But using that as kind of a place where everybody could go and get that information, no matter where they were in the world, has been something that has been incredible to see grow. It's now up almost to 200,000 downloads. We get countless nice messages from people, and I'm able to celebrate people that are celebrating 1 year clean, 2 years clean. I mean, we're really starting to rack up some time, and it's never about using the podcast as the end place. It was always just designed to get people to GA, to therapists, to treatment centers. It was just kind of that first soft landing. And it's really been very successful in doing that. So it's been something I'm very passionate about, obviously, and I've been excited to see it grow. Now, as I said, I wanted to use that as sort of a case study at the front. And then we can kind of talk about some of the things that I use with the podcast to scale your efforts. Because ultimately, that's what we're here for, right? To get more attention for problem gambling. It's the mix of awareness plus action, as the hashtag has. So with that in mind, I'll kind of shift gears now, and we'll kind of go into some of the marketing stuff and advertising stuff. Actually, let me pause for 1 second. Are there any questions that have come in at this point before I go to that section? Don't have the... All right, well, I'll kind of wait and see if Derek or Corey, feel free to jump in and let me know if there are any questions that people may have to this point, but otherwise I'll go into the next little part.
So a question that just popped in that says, what is the response of GA to what you were doing online now?
So that's a good question. And obviously I always kept it separate. It's not a GA resource. I know GA, obviously that was one of my big hesitations. I didn't do the podcast for a long time, or even the blog, because it was like, am I breaking a GA rule? Talking about, because that's in the GA like literature, obviously it's kind of important to remain anonymous even in media. And it was something that I just kind of got to the point where I was like, okay, this is not a GA thing. I'm not going to use GA literature. I'm not going to claim that it's GA. But ultimately, like everyone else in my group, the people I come into contact to, their anonymity is 100% solid with me. Like there's no sharing of that on the podcast. I'm sharing my personal story. And I just got to the point where I just decided like it was important for me to share my story. And if that meant breaking a GA rule, which even that, like, I mean, the marketer in me, the very first page of GA, it talks about, I mean, it grew because of media publicity by a prominent newspaper columnist and TV commentator. So it's one of those things that it's not clearly defined. I know there are people that probably frown upon it. There are people in my group that probably didn't love it, but I assured them there's no sharing of other people's stories. It's purely my story and my experience. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it was something that definitely gave me pause early on. And I was very kind of careful to make sure that I navigated that in a way that didn't bring anybody else's life into it.
And Jamie, could you talk a little bit about the transition from the Gambling Still Sucks to where you are now, and kind of how that first season to your podcast, and then
sure. No, and so the marketer and me, one, I like these projects because they give me something to redesign or recreate. But early on, I mean, Gambling Still Sucks was always a thought for myself, and it was just my constant reminder. And I always talk about, like, I mean, I just need to constantly be reminded, hey, this is not good for you. I mean, even the little logo in my logo, it's a spike up to represent, okay, that 100 to 4,000, but then it goes straight down beyond that to highlight the losses. And it was just that constant reminder. So I started off with Gambling Still Sucks, and it was also just because if I was going to do anything, a podcast, it's like, okay, how do I make it so people know that this isn't going to give them odds? This is not something that's going to give them a who to bet on this week, because there were tons of those when I looked for gambling podcasts. So I created that as kind of a differentiator. But then over the years, I started looking at it, and I was really concerned about creating messaging that was too negative or too much focused in the past. And so I wanted, and I also just had evolved at the time, and I was in a different stage of life. Obviously, I was about 8.5 years in to my gambling recovery at that point. And I really started wanting to have something that was focused on life after gambling, the good stuff. Because ultimately, like, the goal of recovery is so we can just live normal lives, go out, have fun, play with our kids, hang out with friends, do the things that I had given up when I was gambling. So I went through that. That was basically a rebrand to kind of hopefully shift that. And a lot of the content along the way has shifted to being more focused on just everyday stuff. I mean, there's a lot of people that actually listen to the podcast that weren't gamblers, but it's just kind of now more life stuff. And ultimately, when I look back at it, as I kind of hit on earlier, the life stuff was what led me to gambling. It was the fact that I was trying to escape my problems, and I was trying to use gambling as a way to escape those problems and to avoid dealing with some of the things I was really uncomfortable with and I was fearful of. And so now, like I said, shifting the name of the podcast was a big kind of step for me, just because it moved me from focusing and kind of being sad or upset about the past to saying, okay, hey, this is something that happened. It's done. Let's learn from it. Let's grow for it and move into life after gambling. Any other podcast questions or gambling questions? And I'm an open book. If there's something you've always wanted to ask somebody, I'm pretty much, there's not much that I won't answer. So feel free to do that. All right, well, if not, then let's go into the next part, which is my marketing background. So as I said, I've worked in marketing and advertising, branding. That's my career. I absolutely love it, passionate about it, eat it up. And I work with a lot of clients to try and get them to increase their efforts. And so I'm going to give you a background, kind of the quick Cliff Note version, but ultimately the beautiful thing about marketing, it's not rocket science. There are the basics that once you get those down, it really helps and can really put some rocket fuel into your efforts. In fact, my marketing classes, fortunately, because I was not doing a good job of attending class my last few years because I was gambling all the time, and I would not go to classes because why would I need those? But fortunately, the marketing ones, when I switched my major to marketing, they're all pretty similar. So this is something that you guys can, with these basics, I think you can really run with it. So one of the first things I always talk about, and this is when we're talking about technology and using technology, the basics still matter, and it's attention is the asset. And that was true in the past, it's going to be true in the future. So like the one thing whenever you're starting to do stuff is to focus on making sure that you're trying to get as much attention as possible, right? Like you're trying to tell a compelling story that captures the attention of people. And I say that just because I think sometimes we can get caught up in the specifics, but ultimately it's just how do we get attention? And in fact, Derek probably remembers in 2018, we had the national conference here in Cleveland. And I was on a panel, and one of our state representatives, somebody asked a great question, said, how do we get your attention? Like, how do we get you to pay attention to us? And he said, well, you got to show up with more t-shirts. And that was his exact response. Well, you got to show up with more t-shirts. And what he was saying is, hey, you need to get more leverage. You need to use enough t-shirts to get my attention. So that's one of the basic ones. Now, these are the 5 questions that are the most simple questions, and yet all the magic happens, in my opinion, in these questions. So when you're starting to look at your content, when you're starting to figure out, when we get down the road of okay, whether you do a podcast or a blog, or you're just posting on LinkedIn, the daily stuff, all that stuff, if you post these 5 questions on your wall, I think you're going to dramatically increase your success and really help to scale awareness. And it's focusing on these basics. Who are you? What do you do? Who needs to know? Why should they care? And how will they find out? And again, this isn't rocket science, but so many times we miss the point, or we get to where we're so busy trying to get stuff out that we forget that the person on the other end has to be interested. They have to get their attention. So the who are you and what do you do? This is stuff that, I mean, we all need to do a better job, myself included, just kind of sharing. Why do we do this? Why are we in this field? What is it? What are the stories that we see? What's the reward that we get from our day-to-day actions? And I think that stuff alone is compelling content. I love seeing, I mean, when on LinkedIn, there's so much stuff this month, right? But I encourage people to make it not just Problem Gambling Awareness Month, but Problem Gambling Awareness Year. And ultimately, starting there and starting and telling and sharing with the people that are already in your network, hey, you may not know this stuff. Like, maybe you're curious. Why do I do this? What is it? Why is this important? That is one of the first steps that we should look at. So use those 2 questions especially. But then the third one is the who needs to know. And this is one that I'm very passionate about. I think so often, and again, I always get caught up in this. Everybody gets caught up in it. When we're starting to share messaging, we sometimes don't have the audience in mind. And I'll use the podcast as the perfect example. That audience, the who needs to know, there were so many things that made podcasting the absolute perfect platform to reach that group. They were not wanting to be tracked. They wanted to be able to do something that was on their own terms. They wanted to be in control. They needed something they could listen to, and other people wouldn't have to know what they were doing. That's why I didn't do video early on, because I thought, okay, even video, they may be cautious about watching them. So really dialing in and figuring out who your target audience is going to be huge. And then, because that also helps you create messaging that speaks directly to them. Now, when you start to look at all your different stakeholders, because I mean, look at, we have state legislators, we have operators, we have we have RG managers, we have the general public, we have parents, we have the actual gamblers. There's so many different people. And one of the things I think I'd like to see us do more of in the future, and I think it's going to really increase our effectiveness, is we start talking to those specific groups. Take parents. I think there's so much ground that we can get. Where everybody's focused right now on talking to the problem gambler. I mean, hey, if you have a gambling problem, call this number. But all those the loved ones, I mean, me, when I was a loved one, I didn't know what to do. And so we can create content that then other people will want to share because it's useful, it's educational. And a lot of the best content, when we're looking for how do we scale this stuff, how do we get more word out there, giving people something that they can apply to their own life and then use and then share with other people is a great way to do that. So the educational content is really key. And so focusing on those specific groups and creating content specific to them is another way that we can do that. And then obviously the why should they care is a huge one. Why do people care? Why does this matter? Why does problem gambling matter? Like, because in a lot of ways it's viewed as just the individual. Okay, hey, that's a person, that's their own problem. But I think we're starting to move towards more of a public health approach, hopefully, and realizing that there is a true cost to the family, to the society as a whole, that we really need to start to address before it gets out of control. And then the fifth one is the how do they find out? And we're going to touch on that quite a bit here in this next little bit. But we're blessed. And in fact, let me not even bury the lead. Let's just go to that. We have the absolute best opportunity ever. We have this thing, this phone, the video, the stuff that you're watching on. It is the best thing that's ever happened when you're trying to get attention. We have the ability to broadcast to anyone in the world from anywhere. As long as we have an internet connection and they have an internet connection, we can share our message that we're passionate about with the world. We no longer have to wait for permission. And so many times we look for press releases, and those things are good to get big media. But the daily stuff, we have this ability that, I mean, if you took this phone and went to the major NBC, ABC, those places in the world, those businesses 20, 30 years ago, they would have paid unbelievable amounts of money for this ability that we all have now. And obviously it's more competitive, and so we have to focus on standing out. But I just want to stress that we have the ability. The internet has been the great equalizer. And that's why it's easy for me. I get frustrated at times. It's like, man, I wish I had more resources that I could devote to advertising the podcast or creating new things. But ultimately, we have this ability to do so much with limited resources. And like I said, the podcast is a great example. Just using the podcast as that main starting point. Now I've been invited to conferences. I'm connected with a lot of different people that are in different areas of the industry, which has allowed me to have great conversations and really deepen my knowledge and understanding of problem gambling as a whole. So please, if there's something you take away, it's that this little tool is the magic thing that we all need to use a little bit more efficiently, myself included, in order to get more of that awareness. Now, obviously, that said, how do we do it? And I'll point out one of the best strategies that I've stolen from Gary Vaynerchuk. And I put it right here at Gary V on just about every social network. He calls it his document, don't create. And if we look at this last one, the last slide, we were talking about what do you do? Why do you do? And that's ultimately the whole approach of scaling and putting out content is focused on just sharing your everyday life. It doesn't need to be any more complicated. I work with car washes. It's the same concept. It doesn't matter what you're doing on your day-to-day. Pick up your phone. Hey, I'm excited to go on and talk about problem gambling with the PGNO. And then the more of those things that you can mix in, hey, this is really important. This is something we need to talk about. Mix in those other whys, those other questions on the previous one. But ultimately, just share your day. And so many times, I love the one thing that he says is we get caught up in our own head. And as I said, I got the domain name in 2013 for Gambling Still Sucks, and nothing happened with it until 2017. And it was because I was trying to create this big, massive thing, when actually all I needed to do was document my stuff. Hey, this is something I'm passionate about, and do little chunks at a time and share the process of scaling along the way. So that's one of the strategies I absolutely love. You can look that up. And I have some resources at the end. I'll give you a link that you can go, and I'll continue to update those with other ideas. But Gary's approach, and I absolutely love it. He gets interviewed a lot. He does a lot of these types of panels, and people will say, hey, do you think I should do? And he just instantly answers, yes. Do you think I should start a podcast? Yes. Should I post them on LinkedIn? Yes. And it's that mindset shift, and really the ability to think out loud. And it's something that I'm doing a little bit more better of a job of these days, but just trying to share my process, share my thoughts. Sure, it gets me in trouble. There's times where I say things and all of a sudden I have to go back and it's like, okay, that wasn't very smart, and I have to edit it. But even that, the universe rewards action. The more that we put out, and when I say things that maybe don't make any sense and somebody says, but you're not seeing this part of it, that helps me grow and develop. And now all of a sudden I also have somebody else that's sharing their side of it and helps me get educated from their point of view, and hopefully the same in reverse. And that also leads me to the second one, which is the biggest way to scale, in addition to putting out content, is just grow your network. We have all these tools, LinkedIn, Twitter. We have an endless number of social media platforms. It can be draining, don't get me wrong. And we'll talk about that at the very end of this number 4 here. But growing your network and talking to other people has been one of the best ways for me to scale my growth. I kind of just take the approach that everybody has something to offer, and whether they work in the industry in marketing, or maybe they are an affiliate. I've had these discussions with so many different people, and it's given me such a great perspective. And it also helps me tell a whole lot more compelling story because I understand their point of view. So when we're kind of going out and doing the messaging, I don't get caught up on myself like I did in my early days, where I thought I sort of knew a lot of things that I didn't know. So continue to grow your network as you're trying to get awareness. Because the other thing is, as you're sharing these people's stuff, and that's a great tip, is as you connect with these people, share their content, comment on it, go on LinkedIn, take a little bit of time each day to go and see what people are talking about and get involved in that conversation, because those are great ways to do that. And one little tip that I'll give you here, which is something that I do quite often, is I use Google Alerts, and I have the details on the link that I'll put at the end. But Google Alerts are a great way to stay up to date with the different trending topics in the gambling industry, the current news. And there's always people that are mentioned in those ads or those media posts. And so I'll go on LinkedIn and I'll connect and say, hey, that was a really interesting top point that you made on this topic. And it allows me to connect with them and grow my network. So that's one of those ways that kind of a little hack that you can use to start to continue to grow your network. The third one, invest in creative. I'm glad Beth was in my introduction today. That's great. Reach out to people like Beth. Like, creative is one of those places where you can definitely do a lot of good. It's one that it's hard because I know everybody's on a shoestring budget. You're trying not to do too much because you don't have that much to spend at times. But investing in creative is a great way to really kind of scale your awareness, because let's face it, we judge books by a cover, and that is part of the process of how people view things and share things. And then finally, talking about scaling, spot check and batch process. This has been one of the ones that I'm continuing to work on. It's a work in progress. You can call me out on it, but spot checking these different social platforms. I will say firsthand, this is a quick way to get into a time suck. And I think we've all been there, where all of a sudden you're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling on LinkedIn. And so if you hear that and you're kind of fearful of that, I understand it. But one of the ways that I kind of combat that is I pick certain times and I just schedule it in. And it's like, okay, I'm going to go on Reddit for 30 minutes. I'm going to answer all the questions that people have posted on there. Or I'm going to batch process my design work. When I create the design work for tweets, I'll do them all at once so that I can kind of move them together, which allows me to scale a little bit more. So those are some of the basics. And here we go. So I'll put this up, and hopefully we left some time here at the end. If you have specifics, obviously I'd be happy to answer any marketing specific questions, any gambling specific questions, problem gambling, mind of a problem gambler, any of those types of things. But again, I just really want to say thanks to everybody for allowing me to come on here, share my Christmas morning experience with everybody. And I'll continue to update this link here, diveagency.com/PGNO, with any of the other resources. So if there's things that we talk about now and there's a good resource for it, I'll add that in as well. So that's a link that we'll kind of continue to update with some content that you can go back to for some ideas. But ultimately, I just want to thank you for being on here. I know you wouldn't be on here if you're not passionate about this stuff. And so you already have kind of that first key ingredient is the why, right? Like, I mean, a good why can overcome any how is one of the famous quotes that I absolutely love. And so I just encourage you to continue to kind of push yourself, try and learn some of these new technologies. I was on the last one, and the one gentleman said, yeah, I'm not really into the technologies. Well, just play around with them. You'll learn them quickly. And if not, there's YouTube channels they'll teach you how to use any type of technology. But ultimately, just be curious. I did a talk on this a few years ago, and it's really the one thing that really drives me is just an endless curiosity. How can we do this better? There's always a little bit better way. And so I think we can continue to just push ourselves to try and find new and different ways to share the importance of problem gambling. I think we're going to be able to scale and to hopefully offset the ad spend that is surely going to come the other way. So thanks again. And yeah, I look forward to hearing any questions and providing any insight that I can.
And if you do have questions, you can drop it in the Q&A section of your Zoom bar. Jamie, my first question for you is, can you talk a little bit more about Reddit? You talk about it a lot on your podcast, and I'm not a huge Reddit person. So
yeah,
just a little information about that.
So if you want to like improve any area of your life, Reddit is the place for you. I've been on there for intermittent fasting. Like there's like I've learned different things. All it is a community of people that have shared goals. Obviously in the news recently, it was Wall Street Bets, right? But ultimately, what's Wall Street Bets? It's a bunch of kids that want to come together and share investment advice. Now, obviously, they probably got a little bit off track there, but there's Reddit groups for just about anything you can imagine. And so, like I said, if you're familiar with the forum, the 90s forums where different rooms, right? Like that's all Reddit is. And it's a great community, self-monitored. Like I say, I'm on the problem gambling one. It's up to over 10,000 users now, which is phenomenal. So you have 10,000 people that are there around the world that are on just to answer and help other people. And so it's an incredible resource. I would encourage everybody to go look at Reddit and type in something you're interested in, graphic design, gardening, you name it. It is kind of just like a crowdsourced resource for information.
I want to say that I truly love the idea of a podcast because I can see how it can impact all pieces of the continuum of care. So like prevention, treatment, and recovery. Definitely want to reiterate your point in considering your audience and your medium. So I've always thought that video was king for marketing, but I completely understand your point behind why podcasting was what you chose for your intended audience. But saying that, do you currently have any plans on expanding beyond the podcast to any other social platforms to reach new and different audiences?
Definitely, and that's I have some work availability coming up in the next couple months. I'm excited to get more into this space. In the past few years, I've had some existing clients that I've kind of done work for, and now, like I said, the one that was one of my main ones, we've kind of moved on. So I'm excited, and so there's going to be a lot of video coming on. And yeah, video is one of those ones, and you ultimately it comes down to that user, right? Like, how are they going to use it? If somebody's going to be scrolling in bed, you may not want video, or if you do video, you have to have subtitles over it because maybe they don't want to hear the noise. And so ultimately, like in marketing and advertising, understanding how the person uses it or how they might use it or most likely use it is a huge part. And that's why asking those questions, like, and truly understanding what that audience is, and it might be different. Like, you may have the same topic, but you create two different forms of maybe podcasting for one group because they're active and they're on the run, but video for another group. And it could be the same messaging, but just delivered in two different ways.
And then maybe for some folks who might not be as familiar with podcasting, can you talk a little bit about what a podcast is and how they're created and maybe disseminated?
Yeah, so podcasting has been around for a while now. Obviously, there's a lot of different popular ones, but essentially all it is an audio version. People that talking about anything. Early on, I mean, we've seen ones. I think Serial was one of the first one that was like kind of a crime mystery broadcast, similar that we would have like CSI on TV, right? But now, again, just like Reddit, there's a podcast for everything. But ultimately, I mean, there's always space to grow. As many podcasts as there are, the demand is growing a ton. I mean, you can't have enough. That's why I get excited every time I see there's a new problem gambling podcast. I'm like, yes, more information. Because in a lot of ways, also, it's one of those ones that for me, I've done 80 episodes. I'm in my head, I'm running out of things to say, but it's all evergreen content. And I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking that podcasts are just week to week, but it can be almost like a book where you just share it. And it's just a different way of sharing your message. And then people can go back to that in 5 or 10 years and they're delivered. Most of the time people listen to them on their phones. Spotify has grown quite a bit as a place where you can listen to podcasts. And I have a link up on the page to a guy named Pat Flynn, who I learned all the different podcasting strategies for, but don't overthink it. Again, I had my microphone for like 3 years before I recorded one. You can use these things like headphones, anything. There's so many different tools. Google how to start a podcast and try it. It's Gary's yes. Of course, it's a great way. You're going to reach somebody. Maybe it's, you can create a podcast that's for state legislators. Here's all the things that I wish you knew, or for other treatment providers. Hey, here are things that I've learned from my patients that I think would help other people. The use cases are endless. It really comes down to our curiosity.
And I'm curious to know, like, your specific process that you go through in creating your podcast. So maybe just from idea development to the final product.
I have books and books of notes down, and in a lot of ways, one of the best ways I would say to come up with content, I mean, we talk about those questions, is just consume other content. Like, I listen to different things, different audiobooks, and those trigger so many thoughts. When I go on a lot of walks, and I'll just have notes, and I'm just like, note. And a lot of them are just different questions. Reddit is a great one. If I answer a question on Reddit, then okay, that's something that somebody else has. And that question is something that obviously I'm not going to call the person out and highlight their specific case, but that's something that maybe I haven't answered. And I'll go back through and see, okay, is that something I could have answered before? And if it is, then I can point them directly to that resource, which is one of the wonderful things. And when we're talking about scale, and I didn't touch on it too much, but there's a guy named Naval, Naval, that has a how to get rich with a podcast, but it's not that. Like, it doesn't sound, and the whole point is leverage and creating leverage and using the internet for leverage. And podcasting is great because now, for me, all those people on Reddit, if there's a specific topic, I can just point them to the podcast and say, go here and check it out. Because it was becoming draining trying to answer thousands of messages. question.
So I have a question come in. Oh, you go ahead. Yep.
Yeah. Was it scary? Yes and no. So, I mean, you're in this is my studio. We're all at home now. You see the microphone back there. At first it was just kind of weird to do. Didn't come naturally, but I read all these things and overanalyzed it and was like, okay, how do I get my ums and breaths out of the podcast, and a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't really matter ultimately. So yeah, it was something that we all have the fears. One of my favorite authors on just overcoming fears is Brene Brown. And she is fantastic. If you've ever listened to any of her stuff, Daring Greatly is a great book. All of her stuff. She has a great TED Talk. But yeah, you just eventually just go for it. Say yes, try it, and see what happens. Because ultimately, the rewards, and that's my one consistent thing is I always regret not doing things sooner. It was that way with quitting gambling. It was that way with not doing the podcast, and like all these jumps, we all can build up in our head. Okay, nobody cares about this, or they're not gonna pay attention. They're gonna say I'm posting too much. Posting here, but ultimately, if people think you're posting too much, they can mute you. They can stop following you. Like, there's so much in our heads that ultimately, and if you ever get caught up and think, maybe I shouldn't post something, maybe I shouldn't spread awareness for problem gambling, think about the onslaught of ads. Go on. I have a gambling comms list on my Dive Twitter, and you can see all the messages that are going out there. The messaging isn't going to stop anytime soon. So don't be fearful. You can post a lot.
Jamie, I got a question for you.
Sure.
Your wife and fiance at the time seemed to be pretty supportive. Right when you had that first conversation with her, I mean, we're pretty active with recovery advocates in the state, and many of them are the family members, a spouse, a child, a parent of someone who was dealing with a gambling problem, not the gambler themselves. And a lot of the people we work with talk a lot about Gamma Non and the help it gave them being able to talk with other folks in similar situations. I'm curious if your wife has ever done an episode, or if you've had her on, if she ever had a willingness to speak. We always hear about spouses learning so much from each other about some of what they went through as well.
Yeah, to this point she hasn't, and it's one of those things that I've respected. That like, it's not something that she currently has much interest in going back on. But as far as the spouses, I'm in some of the Facebook communities with the support groups for loved ones, and it is devastating. And it's sad that we don't have more resources for them. And so I love hearing that, like, obviously you have the resources and helping them out, because it's just something, like, I think overall we just don't have much awareness. We don't have a whole lot of educate. Like, for me, looking back, like, and so many things I'm trying to create are just things I wish I had. I wish I had a podcast that I could listen to. I wish there was awareness, like education for college kids that says, hey, you're a college kid. Every college kid is probably thinking they're afraid, they're scared, like they want to be bigger, like get to the point where they're successful, but they're not sure if they're going to get there. And there's going to be all these emotions that might lead to drinking too much, to gambling too much, to working too much, to all these things too much. I never had that awareness. And maybe I just missed it, but I feel like we talk a lot about like educating on the books, but not necessarily on life.
Well, I really like that last part you just said, but we're doing some college programming, and it isn't gambling specific. It certainly highlights gambling, but talks about all the different things you just mentioned. And I think we should have a side conversation about maybe seeing if we can have you on or something, because obviously a lot of our programming right now is virtual, so it's easier to bring people in for a little bit of a chat as opposed to schlepping you all around Ohio. But maybe we can bring you in for a little part of that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I look forward to talking with you further about that. Derek just typed in, he had a question.
Yeah, and so talking about collaboration, and you mentioned All In, the Addicted Gamblers podcast, and I see that you were there for episode 158 on my birthday last year. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you as a podcaster have coordinated with other podcasters and what collaboration looks like?
Yeah, that's Brian reached out to me, and it was funny. And he even said, he's like, hey, I should have reached out before, and I should have reached out. Like I always say, communication is a two-way street. Phones work both ways. And so it's something I definitely need to do more of and continue to do more of in the future. But yeah, that was great to have that chat with Brian and Jeff. Jeff has been a guest on my podcast, and it is kind of one of those, the collaboration that I see going on is wonderful to see. I personally need to get more involved in it. I do the podcast. I tend to do them in spurts. You can kind of see, and it's kind of around other work and things. So I'm excited, and hopefully in the next little bit can get to be a little bit more consistent with some of those things and to do some more collaboration. Because ultimately, I think we can get caught up, and I know I personally can get caught up in the logistics of like, okay, should we do this or this, these specific things. But if we step back and look at the big picture, we all want the exact same goal. We want to reduce gambling harm. And even going to the industry, like industry folks, like I talk about, like nobody wants to actually like create harm within people's lives. And so I think if we can focus on those shared big picture goals, some of the smaller things, then we can kind of at least be comfortable to have the discussion. So, and that's the collaboration's been good. I mean, Brian, he was just on with Craig Carton this weekend. I don't know if anybody caught it. Craig Carton, one of the top radio guys in sports in the New York, New Jersey market, had a gambling addiction, served time in prison, now does a Saturday morning show, My Name is Craig. And it's a great show. Like that, just that alone, like shows how far we've come in 3 years. And I obviously can get frustrated. It's like, we all want to go faster, right? Like everybody on this call wants to go faster, but we also need to stop and see, like, there's a lot of good things happening. So Brian was on that, which was really cool to see. And I think that we're getting there. Those conversations are happening in public, so that kids can kind of see, okay, hey, what is gambling addiction? Like, what's it all about? And yes, thanks for the artwork question.
About I have a question about just kind of like your audience. You know, do you see your audience as, you know, people who are just beginning their recovery journey? Or do you have a lot of people who maybe you're just, you know, they listen because they're still, still in recovery and just want to have like that sense of community there?
Yeah, so it's been both, which has been fantastic. And I touch on the spouses. Actually, I mean, I recommend a lot of spouses, because I always say, like, if you want to like help, you need to understand how we think, because it's not normal, and like you're gonna get frustrated as hell. Like, this should work. Like, why are you doing this? But once you understand the mindset, I think, then it's so much easier for them to help. And so I have there obviously a lot of people that are just starting off, the day ones, day twos, and it's hopefully something that they can just pull up. You get an urge, and that's really, we just got to battle that small little habit loop. And so if the urge is to come, and it's like, okay, they can pop on an episode, and there's a bunch of people that said, I can just listen to an episode whenever I get an urge, and that gets me through, what lets me ride that wave. But then there's also people that have had several years clean. My friend from GA, who was one of the early episodes, Rob, I'll share his name because he's on episode, I think it's 9, 10, or 11, somewhere in there. But I mean, he on our call last week, he said, hey, I love the new episodes. And he's like, I got a 40-minute commute, and it just helps reconfirm some things. And so he's going through them again. And that's why, like I said, it's been awesome to see how people have used it. And people use it in different ways than I probably expected up front. But it's something that I want to see more. Like, I want to see everybody create one, because everybody has, and I listen to the different ones, and everybody has so much good information, and we can all target different audiences and bring in those maybe like niche markets where it's like, okay, a podcast directly for spouses, or directly for wives, directly for husbands, like, because those are different things. And the more focused in, and that's why I love the internet, because we can create very specific content that targets a very small group, because now you're targeting that group across the world. And so that market can come together and create a community around it.
And I typed the "Hello, my name is Craig" link in the chat there. And Dan Trolaro, who we had on last week, is the co-host of "Hello, my name is Craig." So you can listen to him more there. And Jamie, when do you consume your podcasts?
So I do a lot of walks, mowing the yard. So it's either podcast or Browns games when I'm doing lawn work. Now that the Browns, knock on wood, are a little bit better, I stopped listening to Browns games or watching them, because I'm like, I'm not going to waste my Sunday and get mad. But I listen to podcasts on walks, just doing dishes around the house. Like, whenever I have some kind of in the morning, I'm an early morning person, and they really are. That's one of the wonderful things. You can listen to them passively, right? Like, you don't have to have the video. You don't have to have your camera and be watching the screen. Like, even YouTube, the moment you click off of it, it shuts down. You can't listen to it anymore. So podcasts are one of those unique platforms. In the car when I'm driving, I'll listen to podcasts. You can just kind of queue them up on your phone. So yeah, I encourage people to check those out. And ultimately, the beautiful thing about marketers, we're going to keep coming up with new and different things. I mean, Clubhouse, we have all these different platforms that are going to continue to grow and evolve, and just play with them, see who's on them. And some of them might work for different audiences.
Kind of want to go back to your story a little bit, Jamie. I'm just curious to know if you still golf today, and then how much of an impact do you feel like that quitting golf had on your path to gambling?
Yeah, so I'm not very good anymore. My son and I went and played Saturday or Sunday. It was awesome. We got out and played 9 holes. He's 8, the age that I started playing, so he's starting to really get into it, and we had a blast. So I'm hoping to play more, because the past few years I was in a golf league. I haven't played just because family, and we had T-ball, and I'd rather coach wobble than coach T-ball than go to a golf league. But my golf game will hopefully come back as he comes. But the stopping golf was a huge part, because competitive athletes, and you see this, and that's why I talk about patterns. Professional athletes, and even a guy listened to the podcast, and he's now on our call. He's local, and it's been random. Some of the local people that I've connected with, and he started sharing a story. I'm like, did you do this? Were you an athlete? Yeah. Did you get hurt? Yeah. And it's the pattern evolves. And so once people anytime something happens in somebody's life that disrupts it, for me, it was not playing golf anymore. I mean, from the time I was 8 to the time I was 21, 22 years old, I played competitive golf. All of a sudden I had that taken away. And poker was, hey, this competitive opportunity. I can go compete with people. It was skill-based to a point. I mean, there's definitely a skill side to things. I had no control over the emotional part, which is where I went completely downhill fast. But it definitely filled that void of competitiveness. And I think that's why, I mean, pro athletes, everybody essentially, life changes, right? I mean, whether you're a pro athlete and you're at the end of your career, or you work in a county and you're at the end of your career, those are big times in people's lives that they become very susceptible to gambling. Divorces, you name it, any kids going away for college, I've heard them all. And that's why we can almost kind of hopefully start to educate people that when things change in your life, that's a huge opportunity to not only fall into a gambling addiction, but any addiction.
Yeah, and I think about just like a personal when around the same time when Moneymaker was on ESPN, and just how much poker was, how big it was even in my own personal circle. So we had cash games. I was in high school, I mean, I was a junior in high school, and we would go to a buddy's house, and there would be $200 cash games, $50 tournaments with buybacks. And it's just, I was like I said, a junior in high school, and these opportunities were available just with friends. So, again, not even old enough to legally gamble in a casino. But it did explode really quick, and it was just really interesting to see how big it was. And I mean, although it's not as big now, I mean, there's still private poker clubs all over Ohio. So
yeah. Well, and actually, Chris Moneymaker liked and retweeted a tweet that mentioned the podcast a week or so ago for Problem Gambling Awareness. So it was just kind of ironic to see that come full circle. And it also, I think, highlights the importance of working across with different people, because he has an audience that might never listen to the podcast or think it's okay. But the moment he says, yeah, hey, I struggle with my mental health, and this is something we need to focus on. So very much important. And also, I mean, you see it with that's why I say with sports betting now, it's very similar to poker. And there'll be something after. Gaming's coming. It's already coming. It's already here. It's just not on people's awareness yet. But I mean, that's going to come after. And ultimately, I think with industries, they try to focus on creating intrigue. I wasn't interested in casino slot games. I wanted something I can compete with. And that's why poker appealed to me. And I think that's why sports betting appeals to people that obviously think might not go to a casino, and gaming will do the same. So, and I saw a question come up I wanted to touch on, which was any ideas to suggest for former athletes who pursue gambling as they no longer compete? Big challenge for men in their 30s and 40s. Absolutely. Probably no silver bullet answer to this one, but ultimately just kind of finding things that they're passionate about, interested in, It could be anything. It could be family. It could be working out. It was a huge one. I know a lot of people that turn to working out and exercising. But the other part there, which I'm always hesitant to just give an answer as something else, is because I've lived the life of all of a sudden you use something else as the replacement for gambling, and it might be a little bit healthier. But we also need to kind of dive in and get some help and uncover what's actually going on under the hood there, because otherwise we just trade one numbing agent for one that's a little bit better. So I don't know if that answers that question, but anything can be. I mean, I find joy in walking. I still hang out and compete with my son. Like, we just don't have to gamble for it anymore.
And Lynn typed in asking if anyone is thinking of a PGNO or ORG podcast. At least from PGNO's perspective, no, we have not thought of that, or at least I haven't, or we haven't had conversations about it. I don't know about ORG, but always something that we can fall back and think about. But also just looking at the resources and our ability to network with others like Jamie, that this can be our platform to share the great work that others are doing. So we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. We can help promote the wheels that are already in place.
And all the platforms anymore have like a voice or video component. So it doesn't have to be a full-blown podcast. Hey, you have a thought, I mean, whether it's a minute, 2 minutes, whatever, pull up your phone, record it and post it. And I mean, those are the things, those small little things, those little bite-sized pieces of content that I think can really do really quite well. And then down the road, if it develops and becomes a podcast or something like that, great. But I don't want us to trip over, because I did it. I tripped over all the small little micro advancements that would have added up over those 7.5 years, small little bites that I would have felt comfortable with, saying, okay, I got to get this podcast and I got to get the mic right and I got to do all these things right. Just the Gary, just yes, go do it. Go try it. Because that's how I've learned. I've learned to make my audio better. I've learned to do those over time, but nobody's ever complained and said, oh, it's terrible. So we overthink things. We all overthink things.
Yeah, which is why I feel like some of those platforms that only allow, something like Twitter, you could get 280 characters, it's just a bite-sized thing. A lot of people will post, more than one tweet, a series of tweets or a thread of tweets, but, things like TikTok are so popular because it's a snippet, it's bite-sized. Vine was so popular because it was literally 7 seconds is all you got,
Yep.
So
yeah, you can check out Gambling Guard on TikTok. He's doing great. I believe it's Nick, awesome stuff. And he's targeting the younger group, the younger audience, to talk about gambling with them. And that's why I like each one of these platforms. If you understand, like, okay, who am I trying to reach on this specific platform? And we can get very narrow and very focused to target these specific groups and give them a message. And ultimately that works because you hear it and you're like, okay, this is talking directly to me. I mean, if you hear something that's like, okay, this is what legislators in the United States need to know about sports betting. If I'm a legislator in the United States, like, that's talking directly to me. Now I sit up and pay attention and see what the next part is. And you can block out some of the other stuff, which makes it better for your audience too, because then they know what they need to listen to, what not to listen to.
And I found it very interesting. I'm in a MPA program right now, and there was a study done. I don't know when it was done, but this is just like I have a slide in my mind right now from a presentation that was this past weekend or a couple weekends ago, where legislators took surveys about how best to reach them or when they'll most pay attention. And a lot of them was if they are specifically named in like they search obviously for news about themselves. And so if you are specifically naming a legislator, that's going to be a really good way to make sure that they're hearing your voice.
Yeah. Their Google alerts are going off with their mentions and that stuff.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Well, as we begin wrap up, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll question. And this poll question is meant just to serve as a knowledge check for attendance purposes. So please engage with that. And then I will also put that poll question in the chat as well, just in case you cannot see it. And I'll leave that open for a few moments. And then also Cheyenne has dropped the evaluation in the chat as well. for Lou, if you don't know the answer, just make sure you put one down. It's literally won't be graded on this.
I think Michael Jackson.
Just let us know you're here. And then Derek, anything as far as closing or wrap up?
Well, just thanks for everyone attending today, and thanks for Jamie. Always a pleasure seeing you and get to actually see you as opposed to normally listening to you as I do on the way to daycare. So Leela gets to listen to you all the time as well. So thanks for taking the time and joining us today, as well as everybody else. And this wraps up our final Tuesday of our conference session. And we'll see you back here on Thursday for the final few sessions, and then we'll wrap out or wind up Prom Gambling Awareness Month for 2021.